You are 7 years old, and this is the last morning of your childhood. You do not know that yet. Your mother knows it. She dressed you without much talking, and now she is walking you along a dusty track toward a low cluster of buildings on the edge of the town, and her hand is very tight around yours. There are other mothers on the same road with other small boys, all moving toward the same gate. Nobody is making a fuss. That is the thing you will remember if you live long enough to remember anything, that nobody made a fuss. At the gate, a hard-faced man is counting boys the way a farmer counts animals. Your mother crouches and looks at you and says something short that is meant to sound brave. And then her hand opens, and you are walked through the gate into a life with no beds you'll call your own, no full meals, no going home, a life whose entire purpose is to turn the softness out of you or break you trying. You are 7. You've heard that the Spartans were the greatest warriors who ever lived, and some part of you, the part raised on films, thinks that sounds magnificent. And I am here to tell you, as gently as I can while your mother's footsteps are still fading behind you, that you would not survive a Spartan childhood. Not this. So let's walk through that gate together, and let me show you exactly what's on the other side of it, and how much of what you think you know is a story someone told you a very long time after the fact. My name's Marcus, and I have to make an unusual confession before we start this one, because this is the episode where I have to argue with myself. I used to teach history to teenagers, mostly badly, and the one topic that always woke the back row up was Sparta. The abs, the shields, the last stand. I loved it too, I still do if I'm honest, and I spend most of my weekends out in a field in reproduction kit being cold and uncomfortable on purpose. So I am exactly the sort of person who wants the Spartan legend to be true, which is precisely why I have to be so careful today. Because of every subject I've ever taken you into, this is the one where the gap between the legend and the evidence is the widest and the most treacherous, where the story is so good, and so old, and so lovingly polished by people who weren't there, that pulling the real thing out of it is genuinely hard. So I'm going to do 2 jobs at once. I'm going to drop you into the harshest childhood in the ancient world and walk you through it, and I'm going to keep stopping to ask, wait, how do we actually know that? Because the answer, again and again, is going to surprise you. Come on. You've already lost your mother at the gate. Let's see what they do with you now. First, we have to kill the fantasy, because you brought one through the gate with you whether you meant to or not. You've seen the films, the oiled warriors, the slow-motion spears, the growled one-liners, the whole glorious, ridiculous, brilliant spectacle of it. And the story those films tell you about Spartan childhood is simple and thrilling. They were bred to be perfect soldiers. They were the hardest men who ever walked, and every boy was forged in fire into a bronze hero. Here is the first problem, and I need you to sit with it, because it's going to shadow everything else I tell you today. Almost none of that comes from the Spartans themselves. The Spartans barely wrote anything down. They left us no great histories of their own upbringing, no memoirs, no training manuals, almost nothing in their own voice. Practically everything we know about how they raised their children comes from outsiders, other Greeks, and later Romans, many of them writing decades or even centuries after the Sparta they are describing had already faded. Some of them admired Sparta to the point of fantasy. Some of them hated it. Almost none of them were there. Historians have a name for this whole tangled problem. They call it the Spartan Mirage, the sense that when you reach for the real Sparta, what your hand closes on is a legend that later ages built and polished and projected backwards, a mirror that mostly shows you what the storyteller wanted to see. I'm going to say that phrase more than once today because I don't want you to forget it for a single minute. The Mirage. Keep it in your pocket. Now, with all of that firmly in mind, let's go into the Agoge. Because underneath the polish, there really was a system, and it really was brutal, and you really would not have lasted it. So, the thing you were just walked into has a name, the Agoge. It means, roughly, the raising or the lighting, the same root as leading an animal. And that word choice tells you a great deal, because the Agoge was not school the way you think of school. It was the state taking ownership of you. Here is the part that a modern person can barely get their head around. In Sparta, and I mean here the boys of the full citizen class, the Spartiates, the ruling caste, not everyone who lived in Spartan territory, and we'll come back hard to that distinction because it matters enormously. In Sparta, a boy of that class did not really belong to his parents. He belonged to the community. And so at around the age of 7, he was taken out of his home and his mother's care and handed over to the state to be raised communally, in groups, with the other boys under public supervision. Think about what that actually means in your body as a 7-year-old. Everything you know, your home, your bed, the smell of your own house, the specific safety of your own mother gone in a morning. Replaced by a barracks, a herd of other frightened boys, and a set of older overseers whose entire job is to be harder on you than anyone has ever been. Your care from that day is not love. It's a program. Now, the honest caveat, because I promise you those in every episode and I'm not going to stop for Sparta. The exact ages, the exact structure, how the boys were grouped and graded. The details shift depending on which ancient writer you trust, and they were writing about different centuries and didn't always agree. Some of the neat, tidy stage-by-stage descriptions you'll read come from very late sources looking back at a Sparta that had already changed beyond recognition. So hold the specifics loosely. But the shape of it, the state takes the child, young, and raises him hard in a group, away from home, that much runs through all of it. And that shape alone would have finished you. Let's start with the simplest, oldest weapon they used on you, hunger. The boys of the Agoge were kept deliberately, systematically underfed. Not starved to death, a dead recruit is no use to anyone but kept short, kept lean, kept perpetually, gnawingly hungry on rations that were never quite enough. And the reason given for it is the kind of cold logic that runs through this entire system. A boy who is always a little hungry learns to endure hunger, and a boy who is always a little hungry learns to get food by his own wits. Because here is the twist that tells you everything about the Spartan mind. The boys were expected to make up the shortfall by stealing. Stealing food was not just tolerated, it was, we're told, actively encouraged, built into the design, a test of daring and cunning and stealth. And this is the whole point, this is the hinge the whole thing turns on. If you were caught stealing, you were punished. Harshly. And listen closely to what that means, because it is not what a modern person expects. You were not punished for stealing. You were punished for being caught. The lesson was never honesty. Nobody in that system was trying to teach you that taking things is wrong. The lesson was competence, stealth, getting away with it. The whole exercise was training a boy to be resourceful and invisible and unafraid to take a terrible risk on his own initiative, and to feel shame only at one thing: failure. There's a famous story attached to this, and I want to tell it to you the right way, which is as a story, not as a fact. The ancient writers pass down a tale of a Spartan boy who stole a young fox and hid it under his cloak, and when he was questioned, rather than be caught, he let the fox tear into him and stood there in silence until he dropped dead, rather than give himself away. Now, did that happen? Almost certainly not as told. It's a moral fable, a little parable Spartans and their admirers told to make a point about endurance and shame. But you know what? It's a perfect fable because it captures the actual value with horrible precision. Better to suffer anything in silence than to be seen to fail. That was the water these children swam in. And you, who have never in your life been hungry in a way you couldn't fix with a walk to the kitchen, would have been undone by the first week of it. And they came for your comfort from every direction at once. Not just your stomach, your skin. A boy in the Agoge was given one cloak. One. For the whole year. A single rough garment, and that was your clothing, your blanket, your shelter. In the heat of a Greek summer and the genuine cold of a Greek mountain winter alike. You often went barefoot on purpose, so the soles of your feet would harden, and so you'd learn to move over rough ground without complaint. You slept rough. On bedding you gathered yourself, the reeds from the riverbank pulled up with your bare hands. And the cold was not an accident or an oversight. The cold was the curriculum. Being cold and learning to not care that you were cold was the entire point. I know a little about that corner of it in my very soft, very safe way. I've slept out in reproduction kit, one thin cloak, no ground mat in a British autumn to try to touch the edge of what that endless exposure does to a body. One night, in a field I could have walked out of at any second with a car half a mile away and a hot shower at the end of it, and I lay there shivering, wide awake, doing the miserable arithmetic of how many hours were left until the sun came up, and thinking with total clarity that I would pay almost anything for a second blanket. One night nearly broke me. These were children doing it for years, being graded on how little they let it show. So let's total up where you are. You've lost your home and your mother. You're kept hungry on purpose. You have one cloak against the whole year's weather and no bed but the reeds you tore up yourself. And it is, by the way, day one. And that's day one. You're already dead. All right, not literally, not the first day. But the soft, warm, cared-for child who walked through that gate this morning holding his mother's hand, that child is already gone, somewhere between the empty stomach and the cold ground, and the dawning understanding that no one is coming to make any of it stop. And you'd have to get up tomorrow, cold and hungry, and do it again. And the day after, for years, with the whole apparatus of the state watching to see whether you'd bend. So let me keep walking you through what those years actually held. Let's talk about dinner, because even eating was turned into a machine for making you into a Spartan. A grown Spartan man did not eat at home with his family the way you'd picture it. He ate at a communal mess, the syssisha, the common tables, a fixed group of men who dined together, contributing their share of the food, eating the same plain fare side by side. And the boys of the Agoge were brought into that world, made to attend, made to serve, made to sit quietly at the edge of it and learn, to watch the men, to answer questions sharply, to absorb by example that your appetite, your table, even your evening meal belonged to the group and not to you. There was no private feast. There was no comfort food. There was the common table and the common bowl and the expectation that you'd want nothing more. And what was in the bowl? This is one of the great set pieces of the whole legend, and it's real enough to be worth savoring. The Spartans were famous, even in their own time, for a dish the other Greeks found genuinely revolting, the black broth. A dark, thick soup, we're told it was made from pork, and blood and vinegar and salt, plain, sour, and famously grim. There's an old anecdote, and again I give it to you as an anecdote, of a visitor from elsewhere in Greece who tasted the black broth and said, more or less, that now he understood why the Spartans didn't fear death. If that was dinner, who'd cling to life? I tried to make a version of it. Of course I did. My wife, B, who is a saint and has watched me do a great many unhinged things in the name of authenticity, came into the kitchen while it was simmering, took one look, took one careful sniff, and left the room without a single word. She has a rule now, B, about what I'm allowed to cook indoors, and the black broth is the reason the rule exists. That was your dinner. That's what you'd have longed for on the cold nights when you were hungry. And you would have found even the longing for it strange because you, raised on flavor on demand, would have had no framework for a life that plain. And it wasn't only your body they were reshaping. It was the way you spoke. The Spartans lived in a region called Laconia, and that is where we get our word laconic, meaning few-worded, terse, saying a great deal in as little as possible. Because the Spartans prized exactly that. In the Agoge, boys were trained not to chatter, not to explain themselves at length, not to fill the air. They were taught to answer questions with a blade's edge, short, dry, sharp, often with a sting of wit in the tail. Speech, like food, like warmth, was something to be disciplined and cut back to the bone. There's a whole tradition of these clipped Spartan sayings that came down to us, and they're wonderful. And you're learning the drill by now. I'd hold most of them loosely, because a good line attaches itself to famous people the way iron filings jump to a magnet, and a lot of these were surely polished up long after. But the value they point at is real, and it was hammered into you young. Don't explain, don't complain, don't waste a word. A modern person, raised to talk through their feelings, to process, to share, you'd have been beaten out of the habit of your own voice. And let me show you the shape of the days themselves, because there was nowhere in them to hide. You were not one boy being taught. You were part of a herd. The boys were grouped into bands that moved and trained and ate together, and over the whole enterprise stood an official appointed by the state to run it, a kind of master of the boys, backed by a squad of young men carrying whips to enforce his word. And the sharpest edge of the discipline, we're told, was handed down not by gray old men, but by the older boys themselves. Youths only a few years ahead of you, given real authority over the younger ones, expected to command you, test you, punish you. The whole thing ran on hierarchy and on the constant pressure of being watched by someone barely older who had every right to make your day worse. There was no adult to run to. The older boy was the adult, and he was grading you. And everything was a competition. You were set against the other boys constantly, in games, in endurance, in mock fights that were not always especially mock. Boys were pitted against each other to fight, encouraged to be fierce, rewarded for winning and shamed for backing down, so that aggression and nerve became reflexes worn smooth by daily use. The point was never the individual game. The point was that you should never, at any age, get comfortable, never stop being measured against the boy beside you, never have an hour that belonged to you and not to the group. Now, hold that loosely too, the exact names of the ranks, the exact ages, who exactly held the whip over whom. These come to us muddled across sources describing different centuries, and I won't pretend they're crisp, but the texture is consistent, and it's relentless. You lived inside a pyramid of hardness, watched from above at every hour, with no soft place anywhere in the structure to set your childhood down. And you who had, at 7, a bedroom door you could close, and grown-ups whose whole job was to be gentle with you, you would have found the sheer unrelenting exposure of it, the never being unwatched, its own particular kind of breaking. Now I have to take you to the single most famous, most lurid image of Spartan boyhood, the one that gets into every documentary, and I have to handle it with more care than anything else I've told you today, because it is the place where the mirage is thickest. At the sanctuary of a goddess, the Spartans worshipped Artemis Orthia. There was an endurance ritual involving the boys of the Agoge. The picture that's come down to us is this. Cheeses were piled on the altar and boys had to dart in and seize them, while others stood guard and drove them back with whips, and the test was to press on, and to endure the flogging without crying out and without giving up. A public trial of pain and stubbornness and nerve. And I'll tell you plainly, I'm not going to dwell on the physical detail of it. That's not what I'm here to do, and you don't need it. What I want is for you to understand where this picture comes from, because that is the genuinely shocking part. Here is the problem. That vivid, brutal, whip-and-altar image comes very largely from later sources, from Roman-era writers like Plutarch, writing well over a century into the Roman period, and the travel writer Pausanias, describing what he saw or was told still later. And here's the twist that genuinely reorders the whole thing. By the time these writers are describing it, Sparta was no longer a great power. It was a faded old town living in part on its own legend, a sort of theme park of its former self, inside the Roman world. And the endurance ritual by then may well have become, of all things, a tourist attraction. Historians studying the Agoge have argued that the whip ritual as we picture it, the extreme spectacle version, belongs to that late Roman-era Sparta, a performance of toughness put on partly for visitors, and that there was eventually even a stone theater built at the site so that crowds could sit and watch. Do you see what that does? The most famous scene of Spartan brutality, the one image everyone carries, may tell us less about the hard classical Sparta of the legend, and more about a much later Sparta performing its own myth for an audience. That is the Mirage in its purest form, a show, a reenactment, which, given what I do with my weekends, I find humbling and a little haunting, because it means some of what we take as raw historical fact about these people is, itself, a costume drama. I make a hobby of dressing up as the past. It turns out the Spartans, in the end, did too. And now we come to the darkest thing, and the thing that, for me, finally cuts through all the admiration, because it forces you to ask what this entire machine was actually for. To answer that, I have to tell you about the people the films never, ever show you. The helots, Sparta's whole way of life, the full-time warriors, the men who never farmed or traded because they trained for war instead, the leisure to run the Agoge at all, rested on a vast enslaved population called the helots. They worked the land. They produced the food. They did the labor so that the Spartiate class could be soldiers and nothing else. And there were far, far more of them than there were full Spartan citizens. Sparta was, in effect, a small armed elite sitting on top of a large subjugated population that vastly outnumbered them, and living in permanent, structural fear of a revolt from below. Everything you've watched me describe today, the toughening, the hunger, the stealth, the endurance, the total submission of the individual to the group, starts to look different once you know that. This wasn't a machine for making heroes for their own sake. It was, to a very large degree, a machine for keeping the helots down. A ruling caste that terrified is a ruling caste that has to stay hard, forever, because the moment it softens, the ground it stands on could rise. And that brings us to the krypteia. The name suggests something hidden, secret. What we're told is that select young men coming out of the Agoge were sent out into the countryside, and that as part of this institution they were permitted, even expected to kill helots, to move by night to watch, and to strike down members of the enslaved population, particularly any who seemed strong or dangerous or likely to lead. A licensed, organized instrument of terror, aimed at the very people whose labor held the whole state up. Now, and you knew a caveat was coming, because this is exactly the kind of extraordinary claim I refuse to hand you clean. Historians genuinely argue about what the krypteia really was. Some read it more or less as I've just described, a brutal secret police terror against the helots. Others think it was closer to a harsh rite of passage, a survival ordeal that tested and marked out the toughest young men. Others suspect the darkest version was sharpened and exaggerated by later writers. The sources are thin, and they don't fully agree, and honest historians hold it as genuinely disputed. So I'm not going to nail down for you exactly how many, exactly how often, exactly how, but strip it right down to what even the cautious reading leaves standing, and it is chilling enough. A society so structured around domination and fear that it built the threat of killing its own workforce into the coming of age of its young men. That's the foundation under the abs and the shields. That's what the legend is standing on. And here, because I never want to leave you with a picture that's too simple, let me hand you the detail that genuinely surprises most people, the one that complicates the cartoon in a good way. The girls. In most of the Greek world, a girl was kept at home, kept quiet, kept out of sight, and given no physical training worth the name. Sparta was strikingly different. Spartan girls were, we're told, given real physical education, running, wrestling, athletic training. The reasoning being that strong mothers would bear strong children for the state. And so Spartan women had a visibility, a physical confidence, and a bluntness of speech that genuinely scandalized other Greeks, who found the whole thing improper and alarming. Now, again, Mirage, always the Mirage. A lot of what we hear about Spartan women comes from those same outside writers, some of them fascinated, some appalled, and it's hard to separate the reality from their reaction to it. But the core is well enough attested to say it plainly. In this one respect, the harshest society in Greece was also, by the standards of its time and place, the one that took its daughters' bodies most seriously. And that's the deeper surprise I want you to walk out with. Sparta is never quite the thing the legend hands you. It's harder in some ways than the films dare show: the helots, the krypteia, the sheer machinery of fear. And it's stranger, more complicated, more human in others: the girls on the running track, the tourist show whippings, the fables dressed up as history. The real Sparta keeps slipping out of the heroic frame we try to put it in. So let's be honest, finally, about where you, the actual modern you, would break, and how fast. The hunger would come for you first, in the opening days, not starving, just the endless gnawing shortfall, and the impossible expectation that you'd steal to make it up and be flogged only for failing too. The cold and the one thin cloak would come for you next, night after exposed night, with no one to comfort you and shame waiting if you wept. The loneliness, the raw fact of being taken from your mother at 7 and handed to a program, would work on something even deeper. The endless grading, the public tests of nerve, the constant watching to see if you'd flinch, would grind you from the outside. And the whole thing would ask of you the one skill you have never once had to learn: to want nothing for yourself, to disappear into the group, to give your body and your voice and your very childhood over to the state and call it an honor. You would not survive a Spartan childhood, not the real one. And I mean that with no insult in it at all. I wouldn't survive it either, and neither would the loudest fan of the legend. Not because we're weak, because we're modern. We were shaped, every single day of our lives by warmth and choice and being loved as individuals and the simple ability to make discomfort stop. And the Agoge was built on purpose, out of the exact opposite of every one of those things. And here is where I turn all of it around on you, because I didn't walk you through that cold, hungry, haunted childhood just to make you hug your own. Though you should. Here's the thing I keep bumping into every time I come back to Sparta, and it's uncomfortable, so I'll just say it. We love this. We can't get enough of it. The Spartans are everywhere in our world, on the gym walls, in the film posters, in the slogans about toughness and discipline and never surrendering. We have taken the single harshest, most fear-soaked, most brutal society in Greek memory, and we have turned it into inspiration. We put it on a t-shirt, and almost none of the people wearing that t-shirt would trade 1 week of their actual life to live inside the thing they are admiring. And I think that tells us something true, and not entirely comfortable about ourselves. We romanticize the Agoge from a very great and very safe distance, precisely because we would never, ever want it. We crave the idea of that hardness, the discipline, the belonging, the meaning, while keeping every single one of the comforts that make real hardness unthinkable to us. We want the abs without the black broth. We want the last stand without the helots underneath it holding the whole thing up. We want the brotherhood without giving up the self, which is exactly the trade Sparta actually demanded, and the one we would never, ever make. So I'll leave the admiration where it belongs, at arm's length, with its eyes open. Yes, there's something in us that genuinely longs for what these people seem to have. A body that could endure, a place in something larger, a certainty about what you were for. I feel that pull as much as anyone. It's half of why I do what I do out there in the mud. But the Spartans, if we could actually see them clearly through all that later polish, would remind us of the price on it, that the belonging cost these children their childhood, that the toughness was built on somebody else's chains, and that a life with no softness in it isn't only strong, it's also, quietly, a kind of poverty we've been lucky enough to escape. So here's my question for you, and I read the comments genuinely, so tell me, what do you think we're actually reaching for when we romanticize the Spartans? What is it in our soft, comfortable lives that we feel is missing? And be honest, knowing what you now know, would you send your own 7-year-old through that gate for one single day? I really want to know. Put it down below. I'm off to keep gently toughening up my nephew Cody, who informed me last week that his phone reaching 20% battery is, and I quote, a survival situation. We are going to have a conversation about the black broth, and my mate Phil wants us to try building an Agoge bedroll out of riverbank reeds next weekend, which means one of us is going to end up in a hedge, and it is statistically always Phil. If walking through that gate with me made you look at your warm, loved, comfortable life a little differently, and if you want me to drop you into another world where you also, let's be honest, would not last, then subscribe and come back, because I've always got somewhere harder to take you. My name's Marcus. Mind your feet, and go be a little too soft to somebody today. You've no idea how good you've got it.